centered. So, over the long weekend, I attended the largest Warhammer 40,000 tournament in Australia in Uprising, Adelaide. It attracted nearly 200 players from all over the country. It was over 3 days and 8 rounds. It's something that I have been interested in doing for a long time, to attend one of these really large major tournaments, because it's just so much of a different scene from my local gaming club. I live in regional Queensland, and there's only about 12 players who regularly play. So to see something at the opposite end of the scale, which would have some of the most competitive players in the country coming, I thought would be a really great thing to experience. Now, I myself am really not that much of a competitive player. I like to play as well as I can, but I'm really not that up with the meta. My painting style is too slow to really chop and change to get the optimal lists that you really need to get to have the best chance of winning. And I just don't play enough either to give myself any real shot. So I wanted to temper my expectations a bit, and I wanted to try something different than most other people would be playing at this tournament, or I think that most other people would be playing. So I had a look at what was really the opposite of the meta choices for my army, my main army, the Orks, and something that doesn't get a lot of love in the competitive scene, but I love personally. My original clan that I went for back when I was a kid was the Evil Sons, and of course the Evil Sons, their main detachment is the Kult of Speed. So I thought I'd bring that to the tournament. And another thing particularly that doesn't get a lot of interest in the meta game are aircraft. So I happen to have not one aircraft but two. So I thought, if I bring the Kult of Speed and I bring 2 aircraft, I'm going to see if I can make that as competitive as I can with the models that I have, and mostly just have fun with it and challenge myself to win one game. That's all I really wanted to do out of this tournament as far as the tabletop. But I really wanted to go there for the experience, to meet people who play the game, to learn. But if I can get one win with the Cult of Speed, I'll be a very happy Ork. So for those who don't know what the Cult of Speed does, there's basically a keyword attached to several Ork units called Speed Freaks. So that's basically anything that might go really, really fast. So most of the buggies, aircraft, war bikers, deathcopters, they're all speed freaks. And the detachment rule says any speed freaks unit can advance or fall back and still shoot. So there's a bit of a disadvantage already in that the Speed Freaks units are generally not the strongest, because they kind of conflict with the main Ork army rule, which is the War, which is once a battle round, you declare the War and you can advance and charge. Your melee attacks get +1 strength and +1 attack, and you have a 5-up invulnerable save. So it's very focused on giving a melee based benefit, whereas most of the Speed Freaks units are more based around movement and shooting and not so much melee. So that's probably one of the main reasons why the Cult of Speed is not really an optimal choice for competitive play, because it's not in sync with the army rule. Now, aside from that, the Speed Freaks units are generally not very strong. They are mostly small single vehicles, and they don't really have enough firepower by themselves to do any damage. So that's another disadvantage with this detachment, in that the stratagems, which normally focus on a single unit, means that you're only really mostly giving the benefit of the stratagems to one model, or maximum 6 models for F-copters or war bikes, those bigger units, but their firepower really isn't that great anyway. So there's another disadvantage of the Speed Freaks, is most of the stratagems are really going to be impacting single models most of the time. So onto the list, and first up we've got the Dakkajets. So I wanted to take 2 Dakkajets because I have 2 and I think they look really cool. Now, the first thing with aircraft is they must start the game in strategic reserve, so they can't come onto the board until turn 2. So they move in straight lines, minimum 20 inches, and then they have to, or they can do a 90-degree pivot. And if they cannot land anywhere, then you have to take them off the board back into strategic reserve. Now the Dakkajets special rule is all their hits are critical hits, and their gun has a bunch of strength 6 minus 1 AP 1 damage sustained hits. Now there's also a stratagem where you can give them lethal hits as well, so you can get quite a few shots off, and they're sort of middling damage. So I thought if I was going to take so many points in Dakkajets, I wanted to try to make them work as well as possible, so I'm also taking 2 mechs. So I put these on the side of the board where I want the Dakkajets to come in, and they can give the Dakkajet +1 to hit. So that means that all of its hits are going to be hitting on 4 pluses now, and of course they're going to be sustained, and one of them I can make lethal with the stratagem. So that's going to give them as much support as they need to try to be effective. So next up I have 2 units of 3 Deathcopters. I was debating whether to take 1 big unit of 6 or 3 small units, and I think just the small units are more maneuverable. So they're just pretty versatile. I can start them in reserve in Deep Strike, and they've got a bunch of rocket shots. So strength 9 minus 2, 3 damage, and they've got a custom Mega Blaster which is the same except D6 damage. So they're pretty versatile and they're just fast and jump around the board. So next up I have a big unit of Warbikers, so 6 Warbikers, and they're led by a Death Killer Wartrike who gives them auto advance 6. I did take the enhancement to consolidate 6 inches, but I probably would take the Was Blaster, which means he's got a 6-inch move afterwards. These guys' job is just to race down the middle of the board and get board control and then pretty much get blown up, but by that stage the rest of my army should be able to catch up. So in order to maximize the theme of Kult of Speed, I've got some buggies, so 2 Scrapjets and a Dragster. Scrapjets basically have a bunch of rocket attacks, and the Dragster can teleport when he advances, which synergizes with the detachment rule, so he can still shoot after he advances. And he has a big sniper cannon, which I'm hoping can just ping off a character here or there, because that cannon hits on a 3+, which is very un-orky. So the last vehicles I have are a couple of trucks. So they're pretty important in a lot of Ork lists to get the foot sluggers up the board, and then once they get out, they're actually quite good for just hanging around the mid board to do objectives, secondary objectives. They do heal themselves 1 wound a turn, so yeah, they're just there to get the boys into the fight and then hold the mid board and take objectives. Now on to the infantry, and to give the list a bit of punching power, I've taken a big unit of knobs, 10 knobs, and they're led by a war boss who's got the faster than use enhancement. So that lets them make a charge after they've disembarked from a vehicle that has made a normal move. So these guys have a lot of power claws, strength 9 minus 2, 2 damage. The war boss has a bunch of attacks in the war. So hopefully these guys will be able to jump out and cause some real damage. So I have taken a second unit of knobs, just a smaller unit of 5, and they may be led by a war boss. I've taken a second war boss with no enhancements. So these guys are going to be able to take down a smaller unit than the big knob, and they won't be able to disembark after moving, so they're kind of a follow-up wave from that big 10-man unit of knobs who may be able to get into combat in turn 1. these guys will mop up afterwards. The other damage dealers I have are the new Breaker Boys, so they're going to be able to punch into some vehicles, and the War Boss may go into those guys depending on what the matchup is. So I've got Uftak Blackhawk, so he'll lead them if he's joining the Breaker Boys. Otherwise, my regular Death Skulls War Boss will lead the 5-man unit of Knobs. So these guys are the first time I'm really playing them, so interested to see how they go. Now to round off the list, I've got 2 units of 5 Storm Boys. These guys are very versatile and pretty much in every army list. So their job is to come in on Deep Strike and just jump around and get secondary objectives. They're also punchy enough to clean up some chaff if they need to, and they can advance and charge, so they can get across the board pretty quickly to get all the secondary objectives or jump on an objective right at the end of the game. And then lastly, another unit that is in pretty much every Orc army are Grots. So I got 2 units of Grots, and their job is just to sit on primary objectives. So one will sit on my backfield, screen out, and generate me some additional CP, and then the other ones will push up the board and sit on another objective, probably the one closest to my deployment zone, and just generally being annoying with their 2OC. So with my list done, it was time to hit the road and get to Adelaide. It's actually a 2-stage trip. I went from Queensland to Melbourne and then to Adelaide, which was a very long drive, but I eventually got there. Adelaide's a really beautiful city. It's very green. There's lots of churches, the city of churches, and the weather was great when I got in there. Nice summer day, but not too hot. So after having a look around, I went into the event. So it was held in a large recreation centre, plenty of room for all the tables, and there was air conditioning too. So it was ideal for a large tournament of sweaty men. My first opponent was Death Guard, basically a lot of scary Death Shroud, some War Dogs and Rodigus, but I was able to utilize my speed to jump right into the middle of the board, and he had a lot of his army deep striking, and I was able to effectively zone him out, so push right into the middle of the board, and he really didn't have anywhere to go. My units were getting killed, but I just had complete control over the primaries and was able to keep scoring. The GW terrain setups didn't help. It basically locked him very much in his deployment zone, and I ended up getting a 98-81 victory, so really happy with that first round. So after round 1, I'd already achieved my tournament goal of getting a win, and that put me on table 2 against Tom with his Dark Angels. So he had a bunch of Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle and the Lion, and this type of list, the brutal melee list, is kind of a pretty hard counter to my list. He just pushed his guys up in the middle of the board. I was able to get in and chop up some of his Deathwing, but then he just had a second wave, and I just really wasn't able to move him from that middle of the board while he just cleaned up my whole army. Final game of the first day was against the Bridgehead Strike Force of Brad, who was a teams player. In fact, there were so many teams players represented. Now this list was very brutal, just jumping all over the place with a bunch of plasma and melter. It was very hard to screen them out. With those small bases, they can really jump into some really small gaps. So this was a pretty brutal loss for me. I think it was about 100 to 30 in the end to end day 1. So despite the 2 losses, I had a lot of fun and came back the next day, and my first game was against Brendan, who had a tank heavy Gladius Ultramarines. So this was a really close game. It was only because he was just a little bit conservative with the movement of his tanks. They stayed in his deployment zone most of the game that I was able to outscore him. The other funny thing was he ended up being from the same tiny little Queensland town where I live. So I thought that was a really pretty funny coincidence. So my second game was against Matt's Synaptic Nexus Tyranids, and this was probably my favorite game, definitely the hardest fought. So he had a bunch of Tyrant Guard with characters and some Exocrines. Again, I pushed up into the middle and he started chopping me up. And this game was the one shining moment for my Dakkajets. They were really effective in blowing away the gargoyles. They even did a bit of damage into the Tyrant Guard and Swarm Lords. So yeah, it was a really close victory for me there. So last game of day 2 was against James, who's probably my favorite player during the tournament. Not much to say about the game. It was an absolute demolition. He had his Vanguard Astartes with a huge block of deep striking Centurions who could just get wherever they want to, just destroy everything. But yeah, James was really passionate about the Adelaide 40k scene and very knowledgeable, so it's great to have people like that in the community growing the game. So on to day 3, and my back was getting pretty sore, but just 2 games left. This was against Adam, who's actually from Tasmania and organises a lot of events down there. So he had Creations of Bile with lots of Possessed and Chosen, and yeah, these big tough melee units that my army really struggles to shift off the midboard. So put everything into him, but yeah, it was just pretty brutal in the end. But yeah, Adam was a great guy and had a really good attitude to the game and is primarily an Orc player, so I was a bit disappointed that he didn't bring the Orks. So the final game for the tournament was against Keely and the Leagues of Votan, which I hadn't played really that much, and they just have some really powerful shooting, especially the land fortresses and those buggies. The other thing was there were some infiltrators who stopped me from zooming over into the other side of the board turn 1. That happened in a few games, so that was a real weakness of my list, when someone was able to stop me from pushing my bikes over the other side of the table. So after 8 games over 3 days, my record was 3 victories and 5 losses. So I far surpassed my original goal, which was to win 1 game. So I was really happy with that. There was a lot of problems with the list that was very much unoptimized, basically by choice. But over the course of those games, I got some ideas, and I'm sure if I tinker around with the list a bit more, I'll be able to get a few more consistent victories with it while it's still being in the theme, which is the Kult of Speed, which is pretty important for me. So one of the things is in 4 of my games, the opponent had a unit of infiltrators, and they're able to put them right in the midboard and stop me from pushing right up the field. So I think I need my own unit of infiltrators to be able to stop my opponent from putting infiltrators in the middle, provided that I get the opportunity to deploy first. So for the Orks, you can either take Boss Snickrot if we just want a small model, or a unit of commandos which will be able to spread out really wide. So I think that's one option that I could take. Another thing was, yeah, the tactic of pushing the bikes up in the first place. It is probably a little bit wasteful because that bike unit isn't super cheap, and they pretty much always got killed either turn 1 or turn 2. So maybe looking at a smaller bike unit, so 3 bikes. I think it's important to have the Def Killer to get that 6-inch auto advance. The other thing about the Def Killer is I will be taking the Was Blaster enhancement, because that will just let me get an extra 6 inches of movement, because it really didn't come up much to get a 6-inch consolidate. Those bikes, and especially the Def Killer, are so big that you can't really maneuver them very well anyway in close combat. It ends up being you just sort of charge the Def Killer in, and then the bikes have to touch him because they can't really get around the terrain very well. So that's another thing I might change. Another thing is actually the second unit of Grots didn't really do much at all for the whole game. So it's only 40 points, but getting rid of them, yeah, is probably going to save a few points that I might be able to put somewhere else. Another thing is the big unit of 10 knobs. It's a bit of a waste. I think knobs, especially if they're charging during the war, 5 and the war boss is really enough to kill whatever they're going into, and they're quite expensive, 210 points for a unit of 10. So I think dropping them down to a 5-man unit and taking a 3rd war boss is probably the better way to go. Could even have 2 5-man units with 2 war bosses in the same truck, so they can branch off and go in different directions. Another thing is the buggies, so I probably would take more shock jump dragsters. I think they're a bit more versatile than the scrap jets. The scrap jets with their D6+1 blast, they sometimes can get a few shots, but yeah, I think the dragster with its teleport is probably more handy, and the custom mega cannon can actually do some good job of sniping out characters, especially if it's one of those characters who doubles command point costs or gives some kind of scary buff to a unit, so it's handy having them. One last thing is the Breaker Boys didn't get into combat with a vehicle all tournament, so yeah, they were quite useless at that role. They did manage to beat up on some Terminator types, which was good, but I really probably switched to tank busters. So at least they've got that 24-inch range to try and shoot vehicles rather than trying to run up to them and hit them with hammers. So maybe tank busters instead of the Breaker Boys, and then yeah, a big mech or a mech with a shock attack gun to jump in with them with some of the points that I'm saving elsewhere. So I'm excited to see what tweaks I can make to the Kult of Speed to try and make it a bit more competitive. So my thoughts on the event: I thought it was really fantastic. It was well organized, so big props to Adam and his team. The facilities were great, the catering was great, the communication between rounds was great, so yeah, it was excellent, and yeah, there was just a lot of prizes. Yeah, it was an excellent experience as far as the event itself. It was easy to get to. I can't say enough good things about it. The players that I played, they were all fantastic. So they were all fair, friendly, they were all here to have a good time. As I mentioned, especially James, he felt so bad that he beat me that he bought me a beer, so thanks mate. For anyone who is a casual player mostly like me and is thinking to go to an event, I would strongly recommend it. Yeah, it's really good to get that different experience. I think there still exists this perception that competitive players are difficult to play against, they're win at all costs, you know, cheating, anything like that, and it's just simply not true. There may be a bit more competitive play happening at the very top tables where there is, you know, money at stake and pride on the line. One thing that really stood out in Adelaide, and I'm sure it's the same in other capital cities, is there a really strong teams culture. So nearly everybody there was part of a team with the shirt and everything like that. So it's just like any sports. If you've played team sports, there is pride on the line and people are very competitive against each other. But if you're coming there as a casual player, they'll understand that, and all my opponents did understand that, and yeah, they just have a relaxed time. So yeah, I would definitely recommend getting out and playing in competitive tournaments, even if you're not a competitive player, because it will also help you. So I learned a lot about tactics from the people that I played against, and even just playing games, you sort of realize things that you could do better, things that your opponents do that you don't really think about. So get out there and sign up to a tournament. It's well worth it. So I hope you enjoy this slightly different style video from me, and I'll be back with the next painting video soon. So thanks for watching.